The generation ship was only supposed to last long enough to make the trip, and once arrived, it was to be dismantled to help construct the first settlement. From what they had hypothesized back on Earth, the planet of Felipe A would have enough resources that the settlers wouldn't need much. As these things always seem to go, though, they were wrong. Even now, almost 50 years since the SSE Hedona had launched, there were surely still populations hanging on back on Earth. But with the transmission delay being 7 entire years, messages were few and far between. In fact, the last message the Hedona had sent out had been when they had entered orbit around Felipe A. The next had been written for nearly 2 years now, the paper still as crisp as the day it had been penned, but no one had the heart to send it. Once they had informed Earth of the truth, then it would become real, no longer a nightmare that everyone still strived to wake up from. There had been over 3,000 people aboard the Hedona, and through death and birth over the generations the numbers were still similar, except the 500 or so still trying to eke out a life on the surface of Felipe. At first, there had been celebrations as the first shuttles detached and departed for the surface, a sense of a long-wished-for dream being fulfilled, tears of relief. But it hadn't been long before the settlers had realized the genuine horror of their situation. The ground had been too soft to support the structures, and no matter how many times the water had been filtered, it was still too toxic to drink or grow food in. With the support of the Hedona, it wasn't impossible to survive, but the settlement would never be independent. It had been almost too much to comprehend. These settlers had waited their entire lives, their entire existence, to make a home on this world. Nothing had indicated that Felipe would be uninhabitable, but as the first images of the dead from the surface, skin and eyes blanched white as ivory from the poison of the water, inevitability had started to set in. Your bones could be interred in the soft soil of this distant planet, or they could be burnt into dust on the Hedona. There was no other fate. It was an open secret that the minuscule governing body of the ship was an elite caste of people, while the others were the working class. At first, the elite had suppressed the images of the bleached white bodies from Felipe, but as more and more came in, and they watched the reserves of the Hedona dwindle, they had changed their minds. They didn't tell the truth to the rest of the ship to be transparent. No. They told them the truth so terror and hopelessness would follow. Trapped within these metal walls, destined to never see the sky or any sun for their entire lives, the suicides began. Humans are not meant to exist in these conditions without hope, without a future, without sunlight on their skin or unrecycled air. So the population lessened, but still not enough. The Felipe A expedition had been launched after the success of the Alpha Centauri settlement. If they had gotten it right the first time, why not now? Felipe seemed even more habitable than Alpha Centauri A, and people were clamoring to escape the wastelands of Earth. So with the funding of some of Earth's wealthiest, the Hedona had set out for a greener future on an untouched world. There were 11 of them now, those that governed the ship, the second generation aboard the Hedona, and where everyone else accepted their Spartan existences as they strived to survive, these 11 did not. They did not need to. Raised in luxury, albeit in a limited scope, there were no rations or hard work or windowless existence. After all, their parents had funded this expedition, willing to die on this ship so that their children and their children's children could live planetside. Almost all the original inhabitants of the Hedona were dead, as Henry watched the clueless workers on the overhead screens enter the never-before-seen airlocks of the ship, called there for a new assignment for those going to the surface. He briefly wondered what his father and the others would have thought. The Coles had been chosen because of a few different factors. Those who had aged out of being able to work, those with disabilities that made it difficult for them to fully integrate into society, and those who had expressed ideas of dissension among the rank and file. A nearly militarized security force kept the ship's inhabitants under control, and they had been instructed with their rounding up the coals, with the promise of their families being spared as long as they held their tongues. So far, so good. On the upper levels of the ship, the plated metal covering of the viewing deck opened slowly, a mechanical whir filling the room as 3 of the 11 elite found seats. Henry, Margaret, and Gregory. Only they had access to this deck, and were allowed to see the stars and the traitorous surface of Felipe. They all watched the screens, the milling about of the workers young and old, the only sounds in the room, the clinking of ice cubes against glasses. Everyone, Henry included, seemed to be preparing for a show. Really, he had no feelings about the situation. What value did human life have anyway, if they all would die in this enormous tin can? Henry's pulse didn't even pick up as the airlock opened, and dozens upon dozens of workers were sucked into the void. Could he have stopped it? Maybe. But he wouldn't have. The only pang of sympathy he had was wondering if they should have used a kinder form of euthanasia. The spaced workers clung and scratched at their throats, skin rapidly going blue and eyes bulging out of their heads. None of them wanted to die, or had even expected to die, and they clawed at their own skin, desperate for one last breath of air. Just one. Down the line of chairs, Margaret hissed in distaste.
This is horrendous.
Seeming more disgusted than bothered. The other man, Gregory, shrugged non-committally. Had we killed them beforehand, who would have disposed of the corpses? We can't show our hand. This is the cleanest way. Long minutes passed in silence, watching the executed's legs kick in useless spasms. Some took much, much longer to die than the others. Some tried to cling to others' hands, but eventually they all reached for their throats, panicked and trying to fill their empty lungs. They all died blind and alone. Something deep in Henry's psyche was spiraling as he watched, but nothing he could name. Emotionless, he pulled up the next things on the agenda to go over with his co-conspirators. At our current levels, we have enough oxygen for 8 more years and water for 20, as long as we continue to recycle the wastewater. Food is up in the air, since we need both water and oxygen to grow it. We still have hundreds of embryonic cattle and poultry in cold storage, but they were meant to be raised on the planet's surface. It's my recommendation that we cease the minimal breeding program we have now and switch over to a vegetarian diet. The live cattle we have now are an enormous drain on our resources. Margaret scoffs, checking her nails, the shadow of one of the bodies floating briefly over her face.
You're telling me you want to eat vegan for the rest of your life?
It's less about want and more about what's best for the total population. But yes, I agree the idea is distasteful. Gregory hums, swirling his glass of whiskey. We depart for the Alpha Centauri settlement next week, right? Henry nods. Yes, on Wednesday. Well, then how many do we need to call before then? Henry checks his tablet and frowns. At least 750.
We're gonna do nothing but space people for the next week then, to get rid of that many. The children and I were looking forward to the departure celebrations this weekend.
We don't have to witness them all, Margaret. It's symbolic, really. Once is plenty, Gregory adds, reaching over to pat her hand. We see their sacrifice for us, brood over it, and that's all. She sighs, but seems mollified.
That sounds reasonable, but what else do we need to accomplish before we depart?
We need to start the sterilization procedures for the working class. As we know, it will take us 15 years to make it to Alpha Centauri settlement from here. So if we want the oxygen to stretch that far, we need to make sure there is no reproduction. Henry said.
Very well.
Margaret says, looking absent-mindedly at the glow of the planet and the silhouettes of the executed outside.
How are we planning on keeping all those working in the recreation quarters in the dark about these executions? We'd be in a bind if they revolt.
Anyone working on our upper decks will be quarantined during departure. We'll be able to keep them ignorant of the sterilizations and such, so everything continues to operate smoothly. What a mess, Gregory huffed. I'll be glad to be done thinking about this in a week. Any words from the settlers' planet side? None, Henry confirmed. Once we're out of the system, they won't be able to reach us anyway.
A shame to leave so many sharp minds behind.
Margaret mused. She wasn't wrong. It would leave most of the scientists on the surface of Felipe, but there was no way to bring them back without one of them realizing how dire the resource situation was. There was no way to keep peace in a population that knew they were being sacrificed for the greater good. Henry thought about his wife and the way she looked, hands folded on her swollen stomach as she smiled at him, all her faith and belief shining through her eyes. If a single piece of his humanity was sick about the frozen corpses outside of the glass, it would never be able to override his desire to provide anything and everything for the beautiful woman who shared his life. He would space 1,000 factory workers and farmers before letting her go without. My wife is pregnant, he blurted out, almost sounding surprised himself. I'm not sure if I told you all. Margaret and Gregory congratulated him, genuine happiness in their voices. They spoke about announcing the pregnancy to everyone else at the weekend departure celebration and what to serve on the menu. It would be Henry's first child, and they decided as a trio to break out some of the very limited bottles of champagne in honor of him and his wife. It was a warm, almost familial conversation, and the uneasiness in Henry's mind over the dead beyond the glass began to subside. Leaders must accept sacrifices after all. I mean, his son or daughter would need air to breathe. The overhead screen sizzled to life again, a new group of people being herded into the airlock. He thought he saw tighter shoulders on a few of them this time around, as if they could sense the death permeating the room from less than an hour ago. One of their comms beeped. Ready for purge on your command, one of the security guards radioed in. Henry watched Gregory pull his comm unit from his belt and press the button on the side. Confirmed, his friend said simply, and the three of them watched as once more they launched the unfortunate innocents into the cold vacuum of space, their last seconds of shock and fear written on their faces forever. Horror skittered up his spine once more as he observed the deaths of so many, especially those with the round cheeks of youth, but he consoled himself that it was a sacrifice for the greater good.
Have you thought of any names yet?
Margaret asked. A few, Henry said, watching a woman in a gray jumpsuit cling desperately to a teenager who had suffocated almost immediately. They had the same eyes. He wished they would shut the viewing deck cover. It's still early.
You're right,
Margaret said.
You two have plenty of time.